Judge. Judge.
The African Union fifth mid-year coordination meeting has concluded in Nairobi, Kenya. The meeting is a significant gathering of regional economic communities, regional mechanisms, and member states. The meeting also serves as a platform to assess progress in the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is the AU's focal theme for 2023. Additionally, discussions will revolve around crucial subjects such as budget matters, African candidatures within the international system, ratification and implementation of AU treaties, AU institutional reforms, and Agenda 2063. Also top of the agenda this year was insecurity on the continent. Kenya's President William Ruto emphasized the importance of the organization's standing on its own feet and being funded by its member states, highlighting the inconsistency of chronic dependence on external partners with the aspiration of independence and sovereignty. Let's dig deeper into the outcome of this meeting. I am Kemini Amano, and you're welcome to The Square. Joining our gathering today are Hannah Ryder, who's CEO, Development Reimagined. She's joining us from London. We also have Adewale Ajadi, who is an African Affairs analyst, also joining us from London. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome to The Square.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Indeed. I want to start with you, Hannah. You know, the talks that have been had at the summit this year, we've heard before. But again, there seemed to be a tough stance of putting Africa on the map as far as global affairs is concerned. Did you get the same feeling?
Well, I think this year was quite a different kind of mid-year summit to previous ones in the fact that we've had much more of a stronger discussion of economic and financial issues than the past. In the past, you know, where the AU themes have been more focused on peace and security and conflict, you know, the silence, the guns and so on. But this year, it's more about AfCFTA, the free trade agreement implementation. So it has much more of an economic and financial flavor. And I would say the governments that were represented in the regional economic commissions and also some of the regional institutions that were represented spent as much time talking about what we as Africans need to do as much as what we need to do with the rest of the world and how we need to, and I think very carefully said by William Ruto in particular, we need to take our place in the rest of the world, not ask for or be given, but take it. So I think those messages are really quite strong this year in comparison to the past, in fact.
Absolutely. And Adewale, one of the things that we also heard from the summit, you know, in Africa's bid to take its place in global political affairs and quite frankly, in all global affairs, is integration on the continent. Do you think they spoke tough enough on that?
Thank you very much. I am not sure that our actions has met our rhetoric for quite a while. I think the discipline that we need to engage in making sure that this incredible opportunity of this being an African century is not missed is not happening on the ground. We still have this compartmentalized notion of how the nation state works. And when we talk about AfCFTA, as much as we are aspirational about it, the actions that we can take unilaterally to move things on have not happened. And we have to start taking those actions. We have to literally start to take the risk that is necessary for Africa to be effective in the 21st century. So we're talking about 2050, Africa would have half of the youth population of the world. There's really nothing that is going in that direction in terms of the choices of our governments. What happens is that young people are increasingly taking risks and risking their lives and dying, literally, trying to get into Europe. This is devastating stuff that can't be changed very easily by the choices we make on the continent.
And you know, you mentioned actions. I do want to talk about some of the actions that will be taken or have been taken that I readily recollect from the summit. We know that the Nigerian president had spoken about the fact that the EAC communities could soon have free access to ECOWAS, which is, you know, the West African communities. The EACs have also given a similar indication. So obviously there is some action being taken to properly integrate or make movement easier on the continent. But I do want to find out from you, Hannah, what do you think are the challenges that have made it difficult for Africans to trade among Africans despite the AfCFTA?
Well, I guess first of all, I take perhaps a slightly more optimistic view than our other guests around the kind of progress, because I think governments are working very hard, and we also have our institutions really trying to push in the right direction, not only on terms of trade, but also in terms of movement and infrastructure development. And I'll come back to infrastructure because I do think infrastructure is the major challenge at the moment. But in terms of movement, for example, you know, AfDB, the African Development Bank, and others are now, you know, producing an index of which of the African countries are the most open in terms of visas for the rest of other countries, other African countries, and so on. There are more and more. There's more and more accountability in the sense of the African Union's flagship project, and it is a flagship project to have a visa-free Africa by 2063 and well before. Just like the AfCFTA is a flagship project, the visa-free Africa is another one. So we have these visions. It is about implementation, but again, the reason for these summits is to really check in on that implementation and really continue to push. And to have governments kind of comparing and regions comparing and almost competing against each other, ideally, to show how much they've progressed. And I think the biggest challenge really is the infrastructure and where we get financing for infrastructure. It came up in the summit. There was a discussion of it in most of the speeches. There was discussion of how can we get cheaper concessional finance for infrastructure and reform of the international financial architecture so that African countries can get that. But until we do more concessional, cheaper finance for infrastructure.
But Hannah, I just want to stay, we'll talk about financing in a bit, but I want to stay on the subject of movement. How significant is this progress when even those who were gathered at the conferences had to get visas to be able to go to Nairobi? That doesn't sound like a lot of progress.
Well, Kenya has been taking steps to improve its visa openness, definitely. The three countries across the continent that are the countries that offer or no visas are required at all for any other African countries: Benin, Seychelles, and Gambia. But other countries, of course, have a lot more work to do, and Kenya is one of those countries. We've seen Kenya have a recent agreement with South Africa, for instance, to have mutually recognized no visas. But that progress will continue. And the more openness that we have about it, the more discussion that we have about it, the better. And I think there's more and more incentives to improve in that direction.
So let's talk about financing, particularly development financing. The AfDB, as you know, you mentioned earlier, has expressed concern about Africa's debt, total debt portfolio. And I do want to get us those figures just to put a conversation into perspective. Now, the continent's total debt stock, according to the AfDB, stands at $1.3 trillion. And the cost of servicing has reached $22 billion as of 2022. The AfDB is projecting that this will increase this year. Now, in terms of Africa freeing itself from debt and also freeing itself from the strings of the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, but also predatory Chinese loans, what are the steps that the continent could take, Adewale?
Well, thank you very much for that, but it's a contradiction. If we want the development of our infrastructure, but we don't want the debt burden that is required to finance this, it's an impossible task. When we set ourselves standards of debt freeness, then we say we are going to be investment free for some parts of what we're trying to do. So what we need to do is educate our people on what we're taking debt for, what concessions we are getting, what benefits we're getting from taking a particular kind of debt. The problem, I think, ultimately, in everything we're talking about is the level of participatory democracy we have, rather than representative democracy. If the people on the ground understand this African integration agenda, if they understand the investment that's been made to make sure that this century, Africa is a global player, for not just for the status, but for its people, then we are going to have debts. We have to have debts. We have to have viability in those debts. We have to have options in those debts. So all this conversation about Chinese investment being derogatory when we are at the same time getting dependent on the Bretton Woods institutions that have very strict regimes has to be considered. What are we benchmarking each other against in terms of debt? Why is the FDB looking at this, not looking at what the debt is being utilized for? Is the debt being utilized for investment, or is it being utilized for corruption? These are the issues we need to look at in the nuances of it. But it is wrong to start making these charts about debt rather than about how debt is effectively utilized to develop the continent and to integrate the continent.
And Adewale, while you may be right on the point you're making, every country on the continent has got debts. Why is Africa's debts, case different? Why does it seem as though Africa's debts, like I said earlier, predatory Chinese loans or very harsh strings from Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank or the IMF? And I'm wondering, what assessment you make of this and how perhaps the AU could position itself in such a way that it protects countries on the continent from harsh loan conditions.
I think you're absolutely right.
That's for Hannah. Let me hear Hannah first, then I'll come back to you.
Yeah. Well, I will also agree with our other speaker that debt is not a bad thing in itself. Even as individuals, we take debt, but we can spend it on good things and we can spend it on bad things. And so the question is, how do we spend it well? The other question is, how do we make sure that the debt is cheap? And especially for things like infrastructure, what we need is patient capital. And one of the challenges with many of our creditors in this very creditor-centric international financial framework is that most of our creditors, either in terms of their actual interest rates or the conditions that come with the loans that we are needing to take for infrastructure or for any other causes, a lot of those come with conditions that then make it fundamentally expensive. They might be expensive in paper in terms of the debt servicing, or they might be expensive in terms of the structural reforms that these institutions or other creditors actually want us to undertake in order to use the loans. And I think what we got, the messages that the African leaders were giving, including AfDB and others, but in particular African heads of state, were saying is we no longer will accept this kind of situation, and we want to find a way to get debt, but debt that we can use responsibly, debt that we can use in order to meet our Africa Agenda 2063 goals, and like the AfCFTA, and those goals will not be possible if we do not have in fact, massively scaled up, but cheap, patient debt.
I see. Well, still on financing, I do want us to talk about how we can be self-reliant. And, we've made the point about debts are not a bad thing, but there is also some level of self-reliance that is required, so we are not always running to these external bodies to fund our development. But even at the AU level, when you look at the operational budgets of the union and its program budget, it's a 4159, 3861 internally generated funds, and then development partners. So even at that level, we see that we are relying a lot on external sources to fund development projects on the continent. So Adewale, where do we start from if we want to be self-reliant, at least to a very respectable point?
I think this is a massively important point. I mean, we are not going to come from 0 to 100% in 1 year. We need to have milestones about those kinds of things. We need to have milestones about where we get capital from in Africa. We have to have an understanding of where the resources will come from. Are we looking at African private sector? Are we developing the kinds of relationship? Can they bear that kind of investment? Are we creating internally generated revenue from our own tax system that is ring-fenced for AU kind of related work? How are we developing these kinds of focus? What I'd like to say is that if we are clear about what our priorities are and what our benchmarks towards those priorities are, in terms of things like self-financing, I'm talking to now, rather than just the larger picture stuff. And we are continuously improving towards that, and reporting to our people about that will make a lot of progress. I mean, it might not be that we're ever going to be absolutely able to define independence by exclusively resourcing our own activity, because that also does not spread our risk well enough. We have to be able to spread our risks. But certainly we have to be clear about what are the indicators that we are trying to develop to progress our own capacity to be independent and have viability and option. And that's down to the criteria as we set for ourselves.
I see. Perhaps we'll come back to financing, but I want us to talk briefly about leadership, because again, it connects with all that we are saying. One of the things that Amina Mohammed, Deputy UN General Secretary, talked about is living up to the vision, essentially encouraging the leaders to walk the talk. I get the impression that, the AU does all the talking, but really it ends there. Then it becomes a talk shop. What would it take for leadership on the continent to commit wholeheartedly to, the vision of the African Union, the vision of Pan-Africanism, the vision of, a well-connected continent, Hannah?
Look, I think, this is a work in progress, and even the improvement that has been made in terms of financing the AU, self-financing the AU is a step in the right direction, and those steps are continuing to be made. And I think it's important that we have leaders saying, look, let us be more self-reliant, and so on. But we have to remember, we have had many years of independence, but not much has changed, and that's not just because of leadership. It is also because of our interaction with the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And I think that needs to be taken even more seriously. We are working on that. But again, we have to remember, and again, it's good that leaders are pointing to this. We have to remember we are trying to improve sovereignty. We're trying to improve our agency. And it's not only what we do at home that matters, it is what we do with each other and also with the rest of the world that matters. And part of our biggest challenge is going to be having to reshape our relationships with the rest of the world with a stronger AU, with a stronger African continent.
Right. Let's talk about security for a bit now. Security was also on the table for discussion, and the union has said that it was committing $2 million to the EAC force. We also know that a new facility called the AfCFTA has been launched again to augment the work of already existing policies, regulations across the continent. But do we need another one, Adewale? Is that what we need now?
Well, AfCFTA can be promising because we have serious gaps. I mean, we in Nigeria sit on the Sahel, and what has been happening is very painful to watch in Sudan, for example, even in places where there has been coup d'etats. But let's be very clear about what our challenge is. Our challenge is that our operating system is still colonial, even though our hardware is African. We have to understand what that really means. That means a different kind of engagement of our people to help them to understand why these things are important, where choices are made in elections, for example. That means that people are not just voting for what happens in their country, they are voting for what happens in their region and voting for what happens in Africa. That means that the AU becomes part of the elections. Sorry, I'm a little bit distant from your question, but I'm coming there in a minute. My point really is that if we don't start to get the enabling mind in the direction of African interdependence and the importance of that to our long-term progress, we're still going to come back and create small institutions to be stopgap. This is a pragmatic intervention to create some stability in countries at risk. And if you look at Sudan being a classic example, you can see the international fingerprints around what is happening in the Sudan that is devastating and killing many people. But what did we do? Many of us took our citizens out of the Sudan so that we can protect our own. And then the conversation about the people of the Sudan who are suffering, who are dying, went off our news screens, and we've moved on. And we're talking about the institution of integration when our brothers are dying every day and killing each other. So my point really is to get to the space where we start to talk in a very, very effective manner. We have to ensure that one of the things that the governments are doing together is evolving the mindset of our people to understand what is an independent Africa going to do in their own behavior, their choices, their voting patterns, and why it is critical for our self-determination and our effectiveness on the longer term. And when we start doing that, then what we are doing on the side in terms of projects start to have some kind of cohesive evolutionary effect.
So it comes back to the point I was making earlier, and about the mindset. It would seem that when we gather, we have one voice. We're talking as a unit. But as soon as we go to our own countries, we forget that we wanted to be a unit, on the world stage. We wanted to be a unit when it comes to continental affairs. What would it take to change the mindset and change it completely so that it will be an African view rather than just a Nigerian view or a Kenyan view? Adewale.
I think it's going to be the work we do in education and the work we do in our mass media, and actually starting to do the work wherever we can. And part of that, I quickly is the first quick win is to ensure that all our countries have some elements of participatory democracy, which means that young people are involved in governance, not just at elections, not just as gone further for conflict of inter-ethnic violence or as inter-party conflict or the lose-lose situation of the winner-takes-all election systems we have, but that we are actually, the AU and everybody is actually involved in educating, in making sure that the syllabus of schools include different African languages. It's making sure that people learn about different countries in Africa and what it means for their trade. So how many Nigerians, for example, know that for hundreds of years before colonialism, trans-African trade is what we did. We call it trans-Saharan trade. And that this port-centric system we have at this moment where we export goods internationally, but at great cost to export, is not viable for us. And what we should be doing is trading better with Republic of Benin and with Niger and with all of these places, rather than considering building railway to Niger as something that is a distraction from national development. These are the things we need to get engaged in.
Right.
ECOWAS should not be an abstract. It should be a reality that we are aspiring for. All the people who sell across borders informally should get into a formal system where we appreciate what they're doing and we elevate what they're doing, not as international trade, not just as some kind of marginal sideline.
Indeed. I do want us to come back to AfCFTA briefly. We know that AfCFTA, is looking to external sources to fund its activities as far as, security is concerned. It has a really brilliant plan on what it plans to do, what it wants to do. But can we seriously, Hannah, deal with restive situations on the continent, coup d'etats, places that are on the brink of coup d'etats? Can we decisively deal with situations as that or as those if our funding is relied upon from external sources?
Well, the AU has been very clear. This is all about African solutions to African problems, and we are trying to do that. At the same time, coming back to what I said at the beginning of the program, one of the shifts that we're having with this summit and this year, in fact, of the AU is this strong focus on economics and the strong focus on development, and in particular through the AfCFTA. Now, why is that important? Well, think about Bob Marley, a hungry man is an angry man. If we do not have development, if we cannot give ourselves food and all of these things which sovereign people require, if we are relying on others in order to do that, if we do not have development, then we will not be able to avoid conflict. We will continuously be angry. So this is why we do need to be focusing on the African continent's growth. We have an agenda. It is Agenda 2063. It has in there movement of people, movement of trade. It has improved education. It has everything that we need, value-added manufacturing. The vision is there. It is really about the implementation. And I think one of the key things about this year is the AfCFTA, it is actually moving. It is moving faster. It is the biggest international free trade area, and it has moved faster than other international free trade areas that exist today. So we should be giving ourselves a pat on the back, but also saying, let's keep going, let's keep moving. And I think that the Mid-Year Summit was an opportunity to do so. And my hope is that speed can continue and that scale can be scaled up even further.
And like we've said before, in order for that speed to continue or even increase, we are going to need infrastructure. In terms of connecting the continent for purposes of trade, Hannah, how would you assess connectivity? How would you assess infrastructure and its impact on AfCFTA so far?
Well, there's no doubt that our infrastructure is very poor at the moment. It is poor whether we're talking about roads, airports, trains, water. All of it is very behind the rest of the world in terms of the metrics. And again, we are a very large continent. And so the infrastructure needs that we have are extremely large in comparison to what is in the rest of the world. We think of China, we're 3 times the size of China. And the pace of infrastructure development in China has not only been fast, it's also been expensive. So we do need to be scaling up the finance that we dedicate to infrastructure significantly. And that is the biggest question, because we cannot do it with our own internal resources. You just do the maths, it just can't work. That's why we do need debt. That's why we do need loans. But if we prioritize appropriately, what we will be prioritizing are the regional infrastructure projects. And again, it's been great to see at this mid-year summit some of the regional institutions reporting back on the regional infrastructure projects that they have been really trying to accelerate and trying to push. And again, that accountability for regional infrastructure, for improved cross-continental infrastructure is going to be important. And I think, again, there's a mindset of African citizens. We should not be afraid of more infrastructure. We do need more infrastructure. Sometimes there's this kind of narrative about, this airport being built or, this new dam being built being a problem. In many ways, these are the routes to our development. And so we ourselves as Africans also need to start owning that agenda and kind of trying to push infrastructure more.
Absolutely. That's important, because I don't know how many Africans, outside of who are not necessarily stakeholders to the document or the 2063 document know exactly what is in it. It's usually those of us who want to know, who know. So perhaps we need to do a little more there. But while we're on the subject of AfCFTA, Adewale, I do want to ask you, same question really. What measures do you think that the AU could take to enhance trade facilitation, economic cooperation when it comes to the AfCFTA?
Well, what my mind always comes to is the level at which we're doing AfCFTA to people rather than doing it with people. And I know it will be slower if we are carrying people along, but we need to spend time carrying our people along. And the fact that we often look at the formal systems, we ignore the informal dynamics. The people, especially women who have been trading across borders forever, have a lot to teach us about the interactions that they've had and the systems they have. And there's nothing that stops us to chew gum and do something else at the same time or work at the same time. What stops us from actually researching what has worked amongst the informal systems, looking at what are the patterns of connection. Across this continent, people have, independent of government, are trade across the borders for generations and still continue till today. Migrate across this continent, these incredible things that they've done forever. There's a lot we can learn about how they do that and what works for them, what kinds of currencies they use, what kinds of loans they use. And if we can scale that up and see which ones are robust enough and which ones can work, everything does not have to be top down. We're too top down heavy. And Africa is one place where when top down does not meet bottom up, you are going to go off the rails very quickly, because the people will show you from their own systems how they want to go. I mean, and I'm not being pessimistic in saying this. I'm just saying we have to be cautious. We have to connect with our people. We have to carry them along. We have to understand what works for them. And we have to know what they use, or even in infrastructure terms. What path do they use? What is the most likely systems that they will use to travel? What systems do they use for their trade? What kinds of markets work for them? What kinds of structure of infrastructure in terms of storage will work for grains, for other kinds of things that people want to move? Where is it best to locate industrial parks that connects countries? What are the ways in which we can transport things more effectively? All of these things we can do top down, but at the same time bottom up, so that we get the best options. And these are the things that the AU should do. It should not ignore what is coming from the bottom up. It should not locate itself exclusively from what is top down.
Well, but, I have to say that the AU, as part of its Agenda 2063 plan, it does have some policies in there for connectivity, like the train network, like a common air market, like a common energy reserve for the entire continent. And so we hope that the financing comes and the leadership uses it the right way. But while we're on the subject of AfCFTA, you mentioned inclusivity, starting bottom up and also top down. At the moment, Hannah, are you able to tell us who owns a lot of the trades that has been made, on the back of AfCFTA? Because it would seem that there isn't a lot of domestic element in there.
Well, what we've had under the AfCFTA are a number of countries. The first step with AfCFTA is to agree that it's there. The second is to translate the agreement into domestic policy, which is the ratification process, which is what 43 African countries now have done. And then the next step is to actually use the tariffs which have been agreed under the zero tariffs under the AfCFTA to trade particular projects. We have seen some of those trades happen. So, for example, there was a trade between Ghana and Kenya with zero tariffs recently as the first step, and I think there's also been some between Tunisia and another country. And so there have been a number of pilots to see how it works, to see what kind of further infrastructure needs, and it is actually trying to address this bottom up as well as top down question. And hopefully that will just accelerate. The other thing is that the AfCFTA have also determined which are the priority sectors that they will be focusing on and really trying to open up trade on those priority sectors. Of course, coming out of COVID-19, pharmaceuticals has to be one. It is a serious priority for African countries to be making our own pharmaceuticals. So that's one thing, that's one of the sectors. The other one is automotive. Textiles, we have incredible textiles, but we just don't manufacture enough. But key to that manufacturing is also trading across the continent for different levels of processing, and of course, agro processing as well. So those four sectors, the AfCFTA, the governments and the Secretariat will be working to really try to open up those sectors first in order that we have a sort of planned process and that it does feed through into your everyday person who's a business person working in these areas.
Are there other opportunities for industrialization on the continent? Because a lot of what we have spoken about will be driven by infrastructure and industrialization. What other opportunities exist for the continent?
Is that to me? Oh, sorry.
Yes, that's for you, Adewale.
Okay. So, I mean, I actually think that the easiest win is around the digital technology rather than the heavy industrial things, and the ways in which we can organize the protocols of startups of digital businesses, connection across African countries, making sure that software-related activities and hardware-related activities are easily green-lighted, making sure that anybody who starts a digital business in, for example, Mauritius, has access in terms of connection to markets across Africa, making sure that those kinds of things, those are easy ways to create inter-African connectivity, to make sure that businesses are large enough, make sure that we are players on the digital space. If you take a Kenya and a Nigeria link, and you take a South Africa and let's say Tanzania link, I mean, these are all very powerful opportunities that doesn't take big infrastructure to do and all of that. And then the AU investing in ways to ensure that connectivity across the continent for that kind of business is available. Registration of that kind of business is easy. Trans-border registration is easy. Using currency over the internet is easier. All of those things, trade across the internet is easier. Those are easy wins that I think they should focus on.
I see. Where will agriculture feature in all of that? I was thinking that would be one of the, the top avenues that you'd mentioned. But you tell me, what do you think agriculture will feature in all of that, Adewale?
It's a big challenge. I was thinking while you were speaking, we were both speaking about cassava, for example, and how cassava would resolve a lot of problems across Africa, and the processing of cassava, the kinds of things that could happen across regions, and replacing wheat, for example, and importation of wheat, and the problems we're having with the Ukrainian war. I mean, those are things that we could pilot. Certainly, there are things that we can pilot, especially in states that have problems presently because of the war in Ukraine and Russia, and durum wheat not being accessible to them and being able to import it. Cassava bread is still viable bread. And you can make pasta with cassava. And cassava is a very powerful crop that is available in the African continent in large quantities in certain regions. I mean, there are many things that can be done like that targets areas of problem that become piloted or prototypes for making sure we cooperate, we exchange things. So, for example, Kenya has one of the best dairy systems in the continent. And if you go across West Africa, we have problems with dairy. We're still shepherding cows across the entire region. I mean, so we can learn technically. We can create the learning. We can have university collaboration about these issues. We can have research institute collaborations for the entire continent and share those things. All of these things are already pilots. But when you choose those pilot areas, you have to choose them, and this is my argument all the time, in conjunction with what is currently operating in our dynamics so we can learn from what we're already doing rather than reinventing the wheel completely.
Indeed. At the same time, we know over the years, agriculture is one of those sectors of Africa's economy that has received a lot of funding. So there's been some significant growth, there's been some significant progress in how agriculture takes place on the continent. But Hannah, there's still a very long way to go, especially if we are affected by the Russia-Ukraine war on the subject of grains. Why do you think that we haven't got to that point, despite the tremendous investment that has gone into agric on the continent? And what else can we do?
I feel like a broken record. It's infrastructure. If it costs a lot for us to take if we can't take our goods to market, we lose our goods. We have to store them, but we often lose them. And that's because our roads are bad. It can also be because we can't get them to other countries. If we don't have that infrastructure, we cannot improve our agriculture sector. It's simple as that. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't still be investing in agriculture directly. Of course, we should be. But I think part of the challenge has been that, again, our cross-country and regional infrastructure is just so behind that we need to put a lot more into that, and that will have the benefits, the externality, the spillover benefit of then helping to improve our agriculture sector, as well as others. There's plenty of trade in agriculture that happens. It's just of not enough of a scale. I would say also, you were talking about the war and the Russia-Ukraine war and our dependency. We have to be very careful about those narratives as well. People have this idea that we are, that the vast majority of African countries are, highly dependent on wheat from Russia and Ukraine. Actually, if you look at the data, we import 3% of all our imports from Russia and Ukraine. And vast majority of the wheat that we import from those countries tends to go to a few countries, Egypt, other North African countries, and so on. So, and we have other staples which we have, like rice, cassava, etc. So part of the issue is that, one, we do not trade amongst each other. So, again, fertilizer from Russia has been reduced. Part of the reason why it's been reduced is again, all of the blockades and so on. But we produce, as a continent, we produce more fertilizer than we import. Part of the challenge is we don't send that fertilizer to other countries. We send it, we export it, we also use it domestically. So a lot of our we have to start getting quite specific about what we do as a continent, because then we can really understand the solutions. And I have to say, a massive solution is about building infrastructure.
Well, we hope that the next time there is a mid-year coordination meeting, we would not be talking about infrastructure as much as we have today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here on The Square. Well, Hannah and Adewale joined us on the subject of, growth and integration, security and leadership for the continent on the back of the 5th mid-year coordination meeting by the African Union held in Nairobi, Kenya. That'll be all today. We hope to see you here again on The Square, same time tomorrow here on News Central TV. I am Kemeni Amano. I'll see you again a little later. Bye-bye.